Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. We are going to be covering cardiovascular disease specifically today. We will cover chronic diseases in our next and final video lecture. So we'll define what cardiovascular disease is. We'll talk about some of the various different forms. We will outline the main risk factors, both those that you can and cannot change. And then we will talk about behavior change skills that you can implement to lower your risk of developing cardiovascular disease. And you might be thinking, cardiovascular disease, that's boring, or that's something that happens to someone else. I don't have to worry about that for me. And unfortunately, for many of us, that is not the case. So first of all, cardiovascular disease is any disease that affects the heart and or the blood vessels that supply the heart. So it's a big, wide range of diseases, including things like heart attack or stroke, but many other diseases are included as well that we will discuss. And it is, unfortunately, a problem for many of us, with nearly half of US adults, 48%, having some form of cardiovascular disease, and even more frighteningly, 1 out of 4 deaths in the US, so 25% of deaths roughly, are due to cardiovascular disease. So this is very important for us to consider, because even though we might feel like we're healthy now, the behaviors that we implement when we're young or really at any time impact our risk of developing and potentially dying from cardiovascular disease. So I know it isn't potentially as fun or thrilling as things like nutrition and exercise and mental health, but it is just as important. So why should we care about this? Well, looking at the most common causes of death, we see for males and females, it takes up a big chunk, about a quarter there, slightly higher for men, but about a quarter of all deaths happen due to some form of heart or cardiovascular disease. So that is a huge number and extremely frightening, only followed by cancer. So cancer is going to be the second biggest leading cause of death, which we will discuss in our next lesson. And really frighteningly, 7 of our top 10 leading causes of death in the US are what we would call lifestyle-related diseases, meaning that they are related to things that we do in our life. So maybe at the turn of the 20th century, the early 1900s, many of the reasons we were dying were considered communicable diseases, things like smallpox and polio. And as we have eradicated those and come up with many technological and medical advances, our disease burden has largely shifted to things that we do in our life, such as smoking, drinking to excess, eating a poor diet, and not engaging in physical activity, as well as having low levels of social support. All of these things can increase our risk of developing any kind of chronic lifestyle-related disease. So what are some of the risk factors for developing cardiovascular disease? Well, some of these you can change and some of these you cannot. So our non-modifiable risk factors are going to be age. The older you get, the higher your likelihood of cardiovascular disease. Genetic factors, we can't change our genes. And ethnicity. Some ethnicities and cultures have a higher risk of developing cardiovascular disease than others. Things that we can change, though, vastly outnumber those that we cannot. So having high blood pressure, hypertension, which we'll define a little bit here, is a big risk. Hypertension just means that there's a lot of pressure on your artery walls. So on the blood vessels that carry blood, oxygen, and nutrients throughout your body, as your heart is contracting and relaxing, there is a lot of pressure put on these artery walls. And the pressure often comes because there's a lot of blockages in the arteries where there's plaque, and now there's smaller amounts of space for blood to travel through, thus increasing the pressure, which puts extra work on the heart. Obesity or excess weight, this is really at extreme levels where this can increase the risk factors for cardiovascular disease, or the risk. We actually do see that just in the overweight category, people who are overweight rather than what is considered normal weight actually tend to have better health outcomes when it comes to chronic disease. So weight is not a great proxy for health, but it does sometimes inform on these two things, physical activity and diet. So a poor diet, one that's high in packaged and processed foods, excessively high in sodium, excessively high in red or processed meats, excessively high in sugar. All of these things can increase inflammation or increase processes in the body that encourage the development of cardiovascular disease. Limited physical activity is a huge risk for developing CVD. Smoking and diabetes, which is uncontrolled high blood sugar. We'll talk about that in our next lesson. That's going to make the blood thicker and more viscous, which is going to make the heart have to work harder to pump it through the body. So there are many risk factors that you can change, a few that you cannot. So how does it affect our body? Well, on a basic level, it impacts our ability to deliver oxygen to everywhere and to remove carbon dioxide. So if we can't get oxygen, our tissues and cells cannot work effectively. And ultimately, if this gets really bad, the tissues and cells can die. And getting carbon dioxide, which is a waste product, out is equally as important. And the other way is that it encourages atherosclerosis. Atherosclerosis is just the hardening of the arteries that I mentioned before. So if you look at this picture, this is like a normal artery without any plaque. Blood can flow easily through. It's nice and supple. It's not going to cause a lot of pressure when blood's going through it. As plaque starts to develop, and this is going to be from things like the poor diet that we mentioned and the lack of physical activity, there's a smaller space now for blood to travel through, and thus every time the heart's beating, there's more pressure being exerted on the arteries, and the heart has to work that much harder. And then what can happen that's even more frightening is a blood clot. And a blood clot is going to be when there's this small, narrow space, a clot develops in the blood, there's nowhere for it to go through, and it actually impedes the flow of blood altogether, which can result in things like stroke or heart attack. So this atherosclerosis is really the underlying cause or the underlying physical factor of most of our cardiovascular diseases. And this is highly related to diet and exercise. And we'll look at that a little more later. So let's look at a few common types of CVD. Coronary artery disease, cerebrovascular disease, also known as stroke, sudden cardiac arrest, congestive heart failure, and a heart attack. So coronary artery disease is a disease of the arteries supplying blood or taking blood away from the heart. And you can see that this plaque starts to develop, and this means that blood can't pump as effectively throughout the body. So some symptoms of this might be chest pain, nausea, indigestion, sweating, shortness of breath, hard to breathe, and a sensation of tightness in the chest. So this is that the blood vessels around the heart are blocked. And eventually this can cause problems with blood getting to the heart. If it gets fully blocked off, then this can lead to a heart attack. So this is potentially very dangerous and is related again to the development of plaque in the arteries. Cerebrovascular disease, more commonly known as stroke, cerebro, brain, vascular, blood vessels, is a limited supply of blood, oxygen, and nutrients to the brain. And the big issue is oxygen. There are two major kinds, ischemic and hemorrhagic. Ischemic means that there's a blockage of blood to the brain. So you can see this big clot here, or this big piece of plaque. Blood can't get through, and the brain starts to become deprived of oxygen. This is by far the much more common kind of stroke. Over here you see the hemorrhagic stroke. This is where there's an actual burst in a blood vessel wall and blood starts leaking out into the brain. This can potentially be much more severe, but is far less common. So what are the common signs of a stroke? Well, typically it's affecting signs that affect one side of the body, since each side of our brain controls only one side of our body. So you might see facial numbness or paralysis on one side. You might see slurred speech. You might see body numbness or paralysis on one side. You might see poor balance or motor skills. And if it gets worse, ultimately you might see loss of consciousness and or death. So this can be really extreme. And unfortunately, the tricky thing about stroke is there are often not warning symptoms in advance. So we don't get like that chest tightness or pain like you might with some other cardiovascular diseases. So this is a very frightening one. Sudden cardiac arrest is a condition that often affects young people. And this one's not actually really related to lifestyle conditions. This involves some defect of the heart where the heart unexpectedly stops beating. And it often happens in young people during physical activity. And if the heart stops beating, it can no longer pump blood and oxygen around the body and will lead to death within a couple of minutes if an AED, an automatic external defibrillator, cannot be applied. So there could be no signs and symptoms of this. People could appear totally healthy, and 1 out of 300 young athletes has some kind of congenital heart condition that puts them at risk. So this is just to say that with young people engaging in physical activity, pre-participation screening is really, really important, and making sure that AEDs are available at all activity sites is exceptionally important. Congestive heart failure. So congestive heart failure, if you look down here, a normal heart has this wall of muscle around it that helps it beat, but these big ventricles that can fill up with blood. If a heart has to work too hard over time, this wall can become thickened and dense, and now, these ventricles are very small. So the heart is stiff, dense, it can't contract and relax very well, and these ventricles can't fill up with blood. So the heart becomes weak. This is often caused by hypertension, high blood pressure, where the heart's having to work too hard over time. Long-term alcohol use can increase the risk. And basically this means that the heart can't pump enough blood through the body, which means oxygen is not getting through the body. This can cause fatigue, swelling, issues with the kidneys due to fluid imbalances, shortness of breath, and can ultimately lead to further complications. But the heart muscle is weak, can't get enough blood and oxygen around the body, and again, highly related to high blood pressure, which we'll define more in a minute. And heart attack, myocardial infarction. So a heart attack is when the heart actually stops pumping blood and oxygen throughout the body, and this is often due to extreme stress on it over a long period of time, blockages around the heart, and the symptoms are slightly different in men and women. So men often have chest pain, rapid heartbeat, dizziness, faintness, lightheadedness, which is fairly common for both, cold sweat, often in feelings of indigestion and shortness of breath. So chest pain is a much more common symptom here. For women, they might get chest pressure, but they might not. And they're much more likely to experience pain in the back, the neck, the left arm, or the jaw. And for a long time, this wasn't known, so female heart attack symptoms went underdiagnosed. Anxiety or sleep issues might come up, chronic fatigue for a few days, and then same thing, shortness of breath, kind of feelings of nausea. The symptoms are slightly different in men and women. Heart attacks are much more common in men, but they also do happen in women. And of course, if you experience any of these signs or symptoms, call 911 immediately, because it's better to be safe than sorry. And now let's look at hypertension, blood pressure. So again, blood pressure is the amount of pressure being exerted on your arteries. And there are two different numbers. If you've ever gone to the doctor and gotten this measured before, you have an upper number and a lower number. So it might be like 120/80. These numbers are referred to as systolic and diastolic. So your systolic blood pressure is going to be the amount of pressure exerted on your artery walls when your heart is contracting. The diastolic blood pressure is going to be the amount exerted when your heart is relaxing. And these numbers actually got changed just about 2 years ago by the American Heart Association. They got lowered, which pushed many more Americans into the realm of having high blood pressure. So normal blood pressure is considered less than 120 and less than 80. So 120/80, under that number, would be considered normal. Elevated is this 120 to 129 and still less than 80 for diastolic. You start to get into blood pressure stage 1, 2, and 3 as you get into these 130/80 ranges or higher. You can read these here, and if it's 180/120, that's a crisis. Hope you probably are at a doctor's office if this is being measured, but if not, you want to call 911 immediately. That's extremely high blood pressure. And so blood pressure is a problem, like we said, or high blood pressure is a problem because it tires out the heart. It puts excess stress on it, and it puts excess stress on the blood vessels. So things that increase blood pressure. Physical inactivity is a huge thing. So that plaque that we looked at before is going to increase blood pressure. If you're not getting regular physical activity helps to push that plaque out of the blood vessels. So that can build up. Eating a diet high in saturated fats, animal fats, or processed fats, there's some research to show that that can build up plaque. However, eating dietary cholesterol like eggs is not shown to increase body cholesterol. So things like eggs will not increase cholesterol, even though it used to be believed that was so. That was somebody's nutrition question too. So I hope that answers your question. And smoking can increase plaque. Excess drinking alcohol can increase plaque. Not brushing your teeth or seeing your dentist can increase plaque, because the plaque that develop in your teeth will actually move into your bloodstream, as wild as that sounds. So brushing your teeth and flossing can help lower your risk of cardiovascular disease. And then stress can also increase blood pressure. So managing all of those things can help you stay in a healthy range. Certainly genetics play a role, and as you get older, for many people it often rises. And then for some individuals, sodium impacts blood pressure levels and increases it. But I may have mentioned this before, 95% of the sodium in the American diet comes from the salt in packaged and processed foods. So this does not mean that you can never salt your foods. This means that you should eat fewer packaged and processed foods. And the reason I make this distinction is because many whole foods, like broccoli or chicken, for example, taste a lot better with a little bit of salt on them. And if you're afraid of increasing your blood pressure by salting them, you may be just less likely to eat those foods because they don't taste as good. So it's okay to salt and season your foods to some extent. It's a better idea to limit the packaged and processed foods if you're worried about blood pressure. And then cholesterol. We have total cholesterol, LDL, and HDL. LDL is often considered the bad cholesterol. These are smaller in particle size. You can remember it by like lousy cholesterol, LDL. These are smaller, stickier, and denser, and more likely to accumulate and cause plaque. HDL is the good kind. These are bigger and more porous, and these actually come and move plaque out of the bloodstream. You can think of this as like healthy, happy cholesterol, HDL, LDL. We ideally want our HDL to be high. Over 60 is a good number, and it's often a little bit higher in women than in men. Under 40 is going to be dangerous. For LDL, we want this to be low. Ideal, best of the best, is below 100. Optimum, good, 100 to 129. And then we start to get into the danger zone, 130 and above. And then for our total cholesterol, we typically want this to be less than 200. And you can see borderline highs up to 239, and high cholesterol is considered over 239. But let's say your HDL cholesterol is really, really high. It's 100. And your cholesterol is 200, usually the doctors won't think that's too problematic because a big portion of that is your HDL. So the ratio of these two is also important. What things can you do to lower your cholesterol? Again, we see exercise comes up. Exercise helps lower cholesterol. Eating a high fiber diet, soluble fiber, helps lower cholesterol. That's why you see on Cheerio and Quaker Oats boxes, it says part of a heart healthy diet. The reason they're allowed to say that is because those foods do include fiber, and fiber does lower cholesterol by binding to cholesterol and pulling it out of the bloodstream. So fiber really helps. And then in terms of raising HDL cholesterol, eating healthy fats like avocados, nuts, seeds, fish, etc. can help raise it. Metabolic syndrome, finally, is a clustering of symptoms, and having 3 or more of them would classify you as metabolic syndrome. So you don't technically have a cardiovascular disease condition yet, but you're at risk for it. So what are some of these symptoms? Blood pressure higher than 130/85, which at this point would put you in hypertensive zone. Fasting blood sugar over 100, so that would classify you as pre-diabetic, and we'll talk about that in the next lesson. A waist circumference larger than 40 inches for men or 35 inches for women, holding more weight around our midsection, increases our risk for developing chronic disease, because that type of fat, known as visceral fat, can put extra pressure on the central organs there and divert blood flow away from them. HDL cholesterol under 40 for men and under 50 for women. We said it's a little higher in women, so we want that number to be high. And then triglycerides, which is just another measure of fat in the blood, over 150. So 3 or more of these is saying, you are at risk for developing some kind of chronic disease, whether that's cardiovascular disease or diabetes. Same lifestyle factors apply. And what are those lifestyle factors? Nutrition, so eating as much as possible real foods, high in fiber, high in healthy fats, lots of plant foods. Animal foods are okay too. You want to be cognizant of the type. Regular physical activity, and again, it doesn't have to hurt to work. It doesn't have to be sweaty or painful. Avoiding smoking, and managing stress to the best of your ability. So lastly, I would love to have you go take this risk factor quiz. I have it here. You can assess your own risk factor for cardiovascular disease. It'll ask you some questions about your age, weight, blood pressure, etc., and tell you what your relative risk is, and then brainstorm some steps that you can take to lower your risk of developing cardiovascular disease now. I know it doesn't feel like it's an imminent threat, but it is a big deal for many of us. And maybe you can share this information with some loved ones who might need to hear it too. All right, have a wonderful rest of your week.